So picture this, it's 1933. America is on its knees, absolutely battered by the Great Depression. Then a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, steps into office, and in just a few months, he unleashes this whirlwind of new laws that would change the country forever. That whirlwind became known as the First New Deal. And today, we're going to break down exactly what it was, what it did, and why it still matters. So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll set the scene with a nation on the brink. Then we'll look at the promise of a new deal that got FDR elected. After that, we dive into the legendary first 100 days, meet the famous alphabet soup agencies, and finally, we'll take a hard look at the results of this imperfect recovery. But before we get into all that, just look at this for a second. At the absolute height of the Depression, the government was using nearly half of its arts project budget to hire painters and sculptors. You gotta ask, why on earth was the government paying for art when millions of people couldn't even afford to eat? To get that answer, we have to go right back to the beginning of the crisis. All right, Section 1, a nation on the brink. Look, to really get why Roosevelt's ideas were so radical, you first have to understand the sheer scale of the disaster. By the early 1930s, the American economy wasn't just in a slump, it was in an absolute freefall. Just let this number sink in for a moment. 25%. In 1932, 1 in every 4 people in the workforce had no job. This wasn't a recession, it was a fundamental breakdown of society. And a truly terrifying part? It just kept getting worse. Private businesses were folding, charities were totally overwhelmed, and so people who had lost everything started to look towards the only institution they thought was big enough to actually do something: the federal government. And if you want to see where the system was really bleeding out, just look at the banks. 40%. Think about that. 2 out of every 5 banks that were open for business in 1929 were just gone by the time FDR took office. And they took people's life savings right down with them. It was like the financial heart of the country had just stopped beating. So, Section 2, the promise of a New Deal. All this chaos and despair sets the stage for one of the most important elections in American history. It pitted the incumbent, Herbert Hoover, against the very charismatic governor of New York, a guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You know, Roosevelt's life was a real story of resilience. He'd served in Washington, but his whole world changed in 1921 when polio left him paralyzed from the waist down. But he fought his way back, becoming governor of New York right as the Depression hit, and he started trying out programs at the state level that would basically become a blueprint for what he'd later do for the whole country. And this right here, this slide really gets to the heart of the choice voters were facing. On one hand, you had Hoover, who warned that Roosevelt's plans were a threat to the very idea of America. But on the other hand, you had FDR arguing that in a crisis this bad, the government had a social duty to step in. Well, the country overwhelmingly chose that sense of duty. It's funny how things get their names, right? During his nomination speech, Roosevelt dropped this now famous line. Newspaper editors just jumped all over that phrase, New Deal. And it stuck. It became the name for his entire plan to fight the Great Depression. But before he could pass a single law, FDR knew he had to deal with the nation's psychology, that feeling of complete hopelessness. So in his very first speech as president, he delivered this iconic line, basically telling the American people that the panic itself was the enemy. He had to restore confidence first. Okay, Section 3, the first 100 days. With the nation's spirits lifted just a little, Roosevelt and his team went on an absolute tear, launching a legislative blitz unlike anything the country had ever seen. And they started with the biggest, most immediate fire, the collapsing banks. He moved so fast. First, boom, he declared a national bank holiday, which just meant he shut down every bank in the country to stop people from pulling all their money out. Then, he rushed a new law, the Emergency Banking Act, through Congress to get them back on their feet. And then, and this was crucial, he got on the radio to explain to everybody what he was doing and why it was now safe to trust the banks again. And these fireside chats were just a stroke of genius. Think about it. For the very first time, the President of the United States was talking informally, directly, to millions of Americans in their own living rooms. He was explaining really complicated stuff in a way that anyone could understand. It was all about building a personal connection and, most importantly, trust. And you know what? It worked. It totally worked. The results were immediate and just dramatic. When the banks reopened, the panic was gone. People were literally lining up not to take their money out, but to put it back in. Deposits were higher than withdrawals. The immediate crisis was over. That appeal for trust had paid off big time. Now, to make sure a crisis like that couldn't happen again, they followed up with the Glass-Steagall Act to create some permanent fixes. This is where we get the FDIC, which ensures our bank deposits, something we still have today. And it also separated everyday commercial banking from the riskier world of investment banking. So let's move on to Section 4, the alphabet soup agencies. Okay, the banks are stabilized, but what about the millions of people without jobs and the collapsing economy? Roosevelt's answer was to create a whole swarm of new government agencies, each known by its 3- or 4-letter acronym. I mean, just look at the sheer range of what they were trying here. You had jobs programs like the CCC, which put young men to work planting trees in national parks. You had these huge experiments to fix entire industries, like the AAA, which actually paid farmers not to grow crops to try and get prices up. Then there was the really controversial NRA for industry, massive building projects like the TVA, and even direct cash payments to the unemployed through FARA. Each one was a bold experiment. All right, Section 5, an imperfect recovery. So after all this unprecedented action, after all these new agencies, the million-dollar question is, did it actually work? Well, as you can imagine, the answer is complicated. Here's the crucial takeaway. The first 100 days absolutely stopped the freefall. The panic was over, and the economy slowly started to climb back. But, and this is a big but, it wasn't a silver bullet. The single biggest problem, mass unemployment, was still stubbornly high. The first wave of programs just wasn't big enough to solve the jobs crisis. So what was Roosevelt's response? He basically doubled down. The thinking was, if the private economy isn't creating enough jobs, then the government will have to. This led to agencies like the CWA, the PWA, and later the WPA. And yes, the WPA is the one that funded those artists we saw at the very beginning. Together, these programs put millions of people to work, building bridges, schools, parks, and libraries all across America. Now, in the end, it was actually the massive spending for World War II that finally pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression. But that doesn't make the New Deal any less important. Roosevelt's first term completely rewrote the rules of the relationship between the American people and their government. It established this idea that in a time of crisis, the government has a duty to provide a safety net and to experiment boldly to find solutions. And that leaves us with a really important question for our own time. What can this era of imperfect but undeniably courageous experimentation teach us today?